The U.S. delegation must speak out frankly at these meetings and be specific about the names of the countries who are the main violators of human rights and the names of their victims.
Our topic for this evening, as you all know, deals with the Helsinki Accords, both their history and their future, and also American policy at the present time. There are a variety of economic and political and humanitarian issues, of course, which are involved, and we're very, very fortunate to have with us to discuss those matters this evening the head of the American delegation to the Vienna follow-up meeting, which will begin this November, Ambassador Zimmerman, and also the co-chair of the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, Representative Steny Hoyer. Ambassador Zimmerman will speak first. Representative Hoyer will then speak about the Commission, and questions, the floor is then open to questions, which will be fielded for the substantive questions on the process by Ambassador Zimmerman, and if they're on the Commission or you direct them specifically to Representative Hoyer, then by him. Allow me to introduce our two distinguished guests. Congressman Steny H. Hoyer is known to all of you. He's a graduate of the University of Maryland in 1963 with honors and was identified as outstanding male student. In 1966, he received his law degree from Georgetown University. The same year, he was elected to the Maryland State Senate, where he served for 12 years. In 1975, during that term in office, he was elected president of the Senate of the state of Maryland, the youngest Marylander to be so elected. In 78 to 81, he was on the State Board of Higher Education. He was elected in a special election to the Congress of the United States in 1981 and re-elected by increasing margins in 82 and 84. In the Congress, he serves on the Important Appropriations Committee. He's very active in the Democratic Party leadership. He serves on numerous caucuses. He's been active as a legislator and, of course, has received numerous awards. He's here tonight, however, because of his special assignment as co-chair of the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, a position to which he's appointed by the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Our second guest, Ambassador Warren Zimmerman, is a 1956 Yale graduate, a Fulbright scholar to Cambridge University, where he received his master's degree in 1958. He entered the Foreign Service in 1962. He's been posted to Caracas, to Paris, to Belgrade, and twice to Moscow. At the Department of State, he's served in the Bureaus of Intelligence and Research and of European Affairs, and has been a speechwriter for the Secretary of State. Most recently, he has served as Deputy Chairman of the U.S. delegation to the Madrid Conference, 1980 to 81. He served as Deputy Chief of Mission in Moscow, 81 to 84. And has been deputy to the head of the U.S. delegation to negotiations on nuclear and space arms with the USSR at Geneva. He's been awarded 2 Superior Honor Awards at the Department of State. He's received the President's Meritorious Award in 1984. This last spring, he was appointed to the important position of Chairman of the U.S. delegation to the Vienna follow-up meetings to the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. We're indeed honored this evening to have these two distinguished gentlemen with us, and I present to you first Ambassador Zimmerman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Byrd. Congressman Hoyer, ladies and gentlemen, I usually begin my talks on the Vienna review meeting by saying that the Helsinki Accords and the Helsinki process are one of the least understood major elements of American foreign policy that we have. But I don't have to say that to this audience, because I know you have a good background in what we've come here tonight to discuss. But I want to give you a little bit of the context of the past in setting the stage for the Vienna meeting, which will start on November 4th, because in this case the past is really very important. What is the Helsinki process? Well, it's a number of things. One thing is that it's as close to a post-war peace settlement that Europe will ever see. There's almost certain never to be a real treaty ending World War II. And the Helsinki Final Act, which was signed in 1975, is about as close to that as will come. It deals with almost all the major issues of East-West relations. And therefore, the second thing that it is the only forum in the world in which all the major issues of East-West relations can be discussed across the divide, the Iron Curtain that separates Eastern Europe from Western Europe. A third thing that the Helsinki process is a major force in the policies of virtually every country in Europe, our allies, the Soviet Union, and the Eastern European countries. It's becoming increasingly a major element in our policy, although one that I think has not been generally recognized publicly and in the press. And a fourth thing that the Helsinki process is a kind of a Magna Carta of human rights, which stands, if I can switch the metaphor, as a beacon to those people in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union who are deprived of those rights, and who look to the 58-page document that was signed in Helsinki as a kind of a charter that gives them some hope and gives them a standard by which to judge the heretofore very sorry performance of their own governments. So I think that that is already quite a lot in the 11 years that the Helsinki document has been in play, and that there have been follow-up conferences of the sort that we're about to have in Vienna. The first was in Belgrade in 77 to 78, and the second in Madrid in 1980 to 83. Let me ask with you what each of the major players in the Helsinki process expected to get out of it. And of course, the major players include all the countries of Europe except for Albania, plus the United States and Canada. It's a very comprehensive list of participants. But for convenience, let me just talk about the Soviets, about the West, and about the Eastern Europeans. The Soviets actually conceived the idea of a European Security Conference. Back in the 50s, they proposed a conference that was not to include the United States, but was to determine the security of Europe. It was an obvious effort to cut us out and to cut them in to a determination of how Europe would be controlled. So the first thing they wanted out of what later became the Helsinki process was a handle on Western Europe. The second thing they wanted was a lock on the frontiers that had been created during World War II, and which, at the time the Soviets first proposed a European Security Conference in the 1950s, remained unconfirmed. They wanted to lock those frontiers in because they were satisfied with those frontiers. In some cases, of course, they included territory that had been taken by the Soviet Union. The third thing the Soviets wanted was an umbrella over contacts between East and West. They were nervous about the kinds of contacts with which their Eastern European allies wanted to have with the West. They were nervous about the amount of contacts those countries wanted to have. And they wanted to get an umbrella over those contacts to let them take place, but to take place under an umbrella that the Soviets would be holding up. What did the West want out of the Helsinki process? When it first began, the West had an essentially tactical objective. In the early 70s, when Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, began to push the process, the idea of a European Security Conference very hard, we were embroiled in negotiations with the Soviets over the future of Berlin, and we were anxious to begin negotiations with the Soviets over conventional arms reductions, the negotiations that later became known as the MBFR negotiations in Vienna. We held out a European Security Conference, or to use the name and the acronym that it's now called, CSCE, Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. We held out that as something that could only come after Soviet agreement to hold talks on conventional force reductions, and could only come after a successful completion of the Berlin negotiations, negotiations that we said would have to end up in a way that was acceptable and in the interests of the West and of West Germany. We got both of those conditions. We ended up with an agreement on West Berlin, on all parts of Berlin, which is still in force and which has effectively removed Berlin as a flashpoint of East-West tension. And we got the MBFR negotiations, which have now been going on for 13 years. Unsuccessfully, some say. I would disagree, because they have maintained support both in this country and in Europe for the presence of American troops in Europe. So even before a CSCE negotiation began, the U.S. had been paid, and in fact paid twice. A second thing that the West wanted was a standard of behavior on issues of human rights. Now, it's true to say, I think, that today the United States feels more strongly, at least more aggressively, on the human rights issues than a number of its European allies. But it's also true to say that at the beginning of this process, back in the early 1970s, it was the allies that were pushing us in the direction of language in a document that would encompass human rights and human contacts. And ever since, the allies have been strong on the issue. Perhaps not as strong as we have, but still strong. A third thing that the West wanted was contacts between East and West. And here, this was a theme that the Western Europeans pushed harder than the United States, because they saw Europe as unnaturally divided, as we did. And one way they felt to break down that division was to create a means by which there could be contacts on all sorts of levels: journalists, scientists, artists, ordinary people, across the great divide between East Europe and West Europe. That was a U.S. goal too, but we didn't feel it with quite the emotion that the Europeans, and of course the Germans, whose very country is a symbol of the East-West divide, felt it. What about the third major group, the Eastern Europeans? What was their sense of it? These countries, which I'll leave out Yugoslavia, were members of the Warsaw Pact, which were essentially satellites of the Soviet Union. How did they look on the Helsinki process? For them, I would say the stake was the biggest of all, because they saw this whole process as a way that they could ease themselves out of the very powerful control which the Soviet Union exercised over them. And I think this was a goal that was shared by both Eastern European leaders and peoples, in varying degrees, of course, and for different reasons. But they saw the CSCE process as a way to slip the Soviet leash to some degree, as a way to build contacts with the West, as a way to fulfill what they always felt was their identity as fully Western countries. And indeed, if you look at the history of Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and the rest, of course, you see that those countries have had their tradition and their history in the West, not in the East, not in the Russian sphere at all. So they had the greatest hopes, and they probably have had the greatest disappointments as the process has unfolded in the 11 years since the signing of the Helsinki Accord in '75. Let me just go quickly over how it all came out. And this will be a very personal view on my part. Who won and who lost? In my view, the Soviets have lost more than they have won. They wanted to freeze the frontiers. To some degree, they succeeded in that because there is language in the Helsinki Accord which talks about the inviolability of frontiers. But by the time the Helsinki Accord was signed in 1975, the Soviets had already executed, they and their allies, the Poles and the East Germans and the Czechs, had executed a series of agreements with the Federal Republic of Germany, which effectively sealed those frontiers anyway. So whatever the Soviets got by way of sealing the frontiers, they had already gotten by those bilateral treaties. And in any case, the Helsinki Final Act left a very big loophole, and a very intentional one, which was the subject of major negotiation, which said that frontiers were not really sealed, that they could be changed by peaceful means and by agreement. Therefore, if there were an effort on the part of the West and the East, or on the part of the West and the East Germans to reunify Germany, for example, there would be nothing in the Helsinki Final Act that would prevent that. If the European community decided to become a supranational organization, there would be nothing in the Helsinki Final Act that would prevent that. But the Soviets lost big in another area, and that was the human rights area. They simply didn't see human rights coming. They were blindsided on that issue. They thought if they put their name to a whole series of commitments on human rights, the same thing would happen that had happened when they put their name to a whole series of commitments on human rights in the UN Declaration on Human Rights and in countless UN resolutions. They thought that this would be forgotten and they could go back to their bad old ways. Well, they did go back to their bad old ways, but it wasn't forgotten. They were so sure of themselves that they published the Helsinki Final Act in Izvestia in full. So any Soviet citizen could get a copy of these human rights commitments for the price of 3 kopecks. And a lot of Soviet citizens read those. And this was the spur for the creation of the monitoring groups that grew up in the Soviet Union and in other Eastern European countries as well. People, intellectuals mainly, but common workers also, who felt strongly that their country should honor the obligations that it had assumed, and who formed organizations, who lobbied, who wrote pamphlets, who spoke out on behalf of honoring those commitments. Of course, you know what has happened to most of them. Many of them are in jail, as Yuri Orlov, the founder of the Soviet monitoring group, is. One of them, 2 of them indeed, Andrei Sakharov and his wife, Elena Bonner, are under house arrest in a closed city in the Soviet Union, and a number of others have been harassed in truly barbaric ways. But this has been a constant embarrassment for the Soviet Union, and it was an embarrassment for them as recently as the early part of the 1980s, when the United States and its allies were seeking to win the battle for public opinion in Europe in order to deploy our Pershing and cruise missiles in Western Europe. To the surprise of a number of people, there was strong support in Italy, in Britain, in Germany, and even in the Netherlands for the deployment of those missiles. And to a large degree, I think, perhaps not sufficiently noticed, the reason those European publics accepted the missiles was the bad image that the Soviet Union had in each of those countries. And that bad image came to some extent, not fully, but to some extent, from the tongue lashing that the Soviets were receiving at the Madrid CSCE follow-up conference, which was taking place exactly simultaneously with the decisions on the part of the Western Europeans to accept the missiles. So while the Soviets' record on compliance in the human rights area has been genuinely abysmal, the Soviets have been made, I think, to pay a price for that record in terms of defeats for major elements of their foreign policy. How has the West done? I can't say that the West has been fully successful because we haven't gotten the kind of compliance from the Soviets that we would have liked to get. We haven't gotten as many East-West contacts, particularly between East Europe and Western Europe, as we would have liked. But I think the West has done well. As I've already hinted at, CSCE is a remarkable forum, a bully pulpit for an assessment of how well or how badly countries have carried out their commitments. And in the case of the Soviet Union, of course, that has been very badly, and we have made it very clear. Secondly, for the West, and I think this is an advantage too, CSCE has proved not to be a static process, but a dynamic process. It has helped to create change. It helped to create the monitoring groups in the Soviet Union. It helped to create solidarity in Poland. It helped to create the Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia. It helped, in short, to create voices from change, for change in the heart of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and I think that's a plus. And finally, CSCE, that whole process, has confirmed, I think, in a remarkable way, the U.S. role in Europe. We have been a major player in the process. We have been a full participant. We have been, to some degree, a leader in the process, which means that our role in Europe, in other than a security role, which of course we have in NATO, has been recognized not only by the Western Europeans, but also by the neutrals and by the East. Finally, how have the Eastern Europeans fared? I think they have come out worst. Because their dreams for getting a little more maneuver room, a little more independence from the Soviet Union have not yet been realized. But I think those dreams remain a potential in reality. And I think as the process unfolds, we may see a little bit more of that independence for which all the peoples of Eastern Europe yearn. That brings me finally, and I will be very short here, to the Vienna meeting itself, which starts on the 4th of November. It might run a year. It might run 2 years. How will the United States approach that meeting? Let me make just 2 points here, and if there are other elements of interest, we can handle those in the question period. Our primary objective will be to try to use the Vienna meeting to ensure compliance with commitments already undertaken in the Helsinki Final Act, undertaken in the long document that was negotiated at the Madrid meeting, which ended in 1983. Our view is that future commitments are not really very valuable as long as past commitments are not being honored. So we will focus on that, and we are going to be frank and candid and open with regard to the lack of compliance and indeed the violations of the Soviets and some of their allies. That's the first major objective. The second major objective for the U.S. is in the security side of CSCE, about which I've had less to say today, but which is very important. We may well be faced with having to decide at the Vienna meeting whether the Vienna meeting will be the major forum and CSCE will be the major process for the negotiation of conventional arms reductions. That is, the reductions that are now going on at the MBFR talks. There have been proposals from both East and West, specifically from the Soviet Union and from France, to move those negotiations to CSCE, and we will have to decide at Vienna whether we want that to happen. Whatever the outcome of that, we will want to make sure of two things in the security area. One is that whatever we do contributes to greater stability rather than less, and the second thing is we will want to make sure that whatever happens in security is balanced by progress on compliance in the human rights and the other areas. I was enjoined by Mr. Byrd not to say anything about the Commission, and I'm going to violate that because I do want to say one thing, which is that the Commission, the Helsinki Commission, will be a full participant, both its leaders and its staff, at the Vienna meeting, as it has been at Madrid and Belgrade. And I want to say on the part of the President and the Secretary of State and the administration that we welcome that participation. We rely on the Commission for its expertise, for its experience, for its insights, particularly in the human rights area, but across the board. And I want to say, in the presence of Congressman Hoyer, that he has played, I think, a remarkable role with his energy and his wisdom in helping the formulation of policy, not only for the Vienna meeting coming up, but for some of the meetings that have gone on between Madrid and Vienna. And with that, I want to thank you for allowing me to come and talk to you.
I thank the Ambassador for those very kind remarks. You check to see if it's too late to get in the Senate race. I am pleased to be here with so many of my friends in the Baltimore area. I'm from that foreign country down south that's called Prince George's County, as you know, and very pleased to be here. The Ambassador has given you an overview of the history and of the positions taken by the West and the East and the ramifications, as he sees it, with reference to our participation in the Helsinki process. He also, in concluding, and I thank him for that, was kind enough to observe that the Helsinki Commission, of which I'm going to speak more broadly, has played a significant role as we have developed the United States' role in the Helsinki process. Demonstrative of that, it seems to me, are two people who are here today who I would like to introduce. Ambassador Zimmerman is the representative of the United States to the Vienna Review Conference, the third such conference following the 1975 Helsinki Final Act. We will have two deputies serving with Ambassador Zimmerman in Vienna. One is Bob Froeck. And Bob, Ambassador Froeck, I'd like to introduce you. Ambassador Froeck is one of the deputies. Ambassador, I didn't hear that either, but Ambassador Froeck, she wants to see you. You have a fan. Ambassador Froeck is a career diplomat. Serving with him as the co-equal deputy of the U.S. delegation to Vienna is Sam Wise, a former career diplomat, now the executive director of the Helsinki Commission. Ambassador Sam Wise. I think that clearly demonstrates that this is a unique legislative commission in that it is serving really in somewhat of an executive capacity with the ambassador and the State Department representatives. Now, let me say a few words about the commission on which I serve with Senator Alfonso D'Amato of New York. He and I are the co-chairmen. He is the chairman, and I am the co-chairman. In January of 1987, assuming the folks in Prince George's County see fit to return me to the Congress of the United States, I will serve as the chairman, and he will serve as the co-chairman. The Helsinki Commission is, of course, named after the city in which the document itself was adopted. It was established by law in 1976, less than a year after 33 countries of Europe and Canada and the United States signed the Helsinki Final Act, the blueprint of the wide range of activities which has become known as the Helsinki process and of which Ambassador Zimmerman just talked. The moving force behind the formation of the Commission back in 1976 was a belief by some members of Congress that the Helsinki process provided a new and unique forum to press our human rights concerns with the government of the Soviet Union and of Eastern Europe. This has remained the focus of the Commission, and it's from its inception through its first 9 years under the chairmanship, very able chairmanship, of Donnie Fasel. Donnie Fasel is my immediate predecessor from the House. We had the opportunity here in Baltimore to hear from Donnie Fasel, who is now the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Representatives. It will continue to be the Commission's focus, I'm sure, when the chairmanship passes to the House of Representatives in the next Congress. I'm very sure of that, as a matter of fact. Through a variety of activities, including public hearings, reports, congressional statements, casework in support of repressed human beings throughout the Eastern world, and direct participation in the diplomatic negotiations component of the process, witness Sam Wise. The commissioners and the commission staff have earned a worldwide reputation for our work in human rights. Indeed, the staff of the commission are perceived by many as the experts in this country on the issue of human rights as it relates to Europe and the United States. Among the many thousands of individual cases we have worked on, there are a good number from the state of Maryland and indeed this city of Baltimore. They include efforts on behalf of Elena Belovlenkov of Baltimore, whom you may know. Her husband, Yuri, has not been granted permission to leave, and we are pressing those efforts to this day. In addition, the case of Alexander Kodomarov, a former Baltimore resident, has been high on the agenda of the Commission. We indeed deal with hundreds of cases on an ongoing basis of people who seek to immigrate, seek to reunify families, and seek to have human contacts, all consistent with the undertakings of the Helsinki Final Act. During the early years of the Commission, which has grown from 6 members each from the Senate and the House to the present 9 members from the Senate and 9 members from the House, the Commission did not always see eye to eye with the State Department. In fact, there were considerable differences over both policy and turf, as you can understand. However, with the experience over the years working with each other, I believe these tensions have substantially subsided and that a modus operandi has been found which serves the interest of both parties. From the Commission's point of view, human rights are now recognized as a cardinal element of U.S. foreign policy, as enunciated clearly by the President and by the Secretary of State and by Warren Zimmerman, our ambassador, and his predecessors in this process. What this boils down to in practice for the Vienna Review Conference is that Senator D'Amato and I, as leaders of the Commission, will be working closely with Ambassador Zimmerman as Vice Chairman of the U.S. delegation. Sam is the co-deputy with Bob, but they have accorded Senator D'Amato and I, for purposes, I'm sure, of further funding, as the Vice Chairman of the delegation. Senator D'Amato and I both being on the Appropriations Committee enhances our status somewhat, although only slightly. We intend to be active in the work of the delegation as our congressional schedules permit, and indeed we plan to get to Vienna just as soon after Election Day as we can. I intend to lead a delegation to Vienna on the 7th of November, and Senator D'Amato will be going over to Vienna shortly thereafter. Now, let me turn to the Vienna meeting itself. let me give you some Commission perspectives on what we hope to achieve there and how. The U.S. delegation will press hard for as much openness as possible in Vienna. The Soviets have historically and will undoubtedly in Vienna press for private meetings. They do not like the exposure of public meetings. They do not like to discuss the issues of human rights in a public forum. And they have consistently refused to allow such procedure to be adopted. And in light of the fact that the Helsinki Commission operates through consensus, as it must, they have been successful in their efforts to thwart public meetings. It is important to have a conference which is as accessible to the public as possible, however, and not merely a restricted conclave of diplomats behind closed doors. For this reason, the Commission has been in the forefront of the campaign to have private American human rights advocates and other citizens on the U.S. delegation. The State Department not only has agreed, but has enthusiastically pursued that policy. And we will have public American delegates in Vienna, as we have had in other forums of the Helsinki process. The Commission also strives for maximum accessibility at Vienna for the press, for interested non-governmental groups, and for just plain citizens who want to know what's going on and have a chance to express their views. Finally, the Commission has always taken a stand in favor of maximum cooperation with NGO groups who visit CSC meetings, and at Vienna, we will continue that practice. On the substance of the Vienna Conference, the Commission has consistently urged that to be effective, the U.S. delegation must speak out frankly at these meetings and be specific about the names of the countries who are the main violators of human rights and the names of their victims. Ambassador Zimmerman has assured me that he will be specific in his speeches and will not pull any punches. Our major concern is the gaping lack of compliance by the Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies in fulfilling their human rights undertakings. The Commission position is that there must be a significant reversal of the human rights situation before there is any further movement in any other CSCE area, military, economic, cultural, or related matters dealing with the Helsinki Accords. There is division within the Commission, I must tell you frankly, with respect to how tight this linkage is. But there is no doubt that there is a consensus from right to left, Republican to Democrat, within the Commission, that there is a clear relationship between the Soviets and Eastern Bloc's undertakings as it relates to human rights and the credibility that they have in dealing with security matters. If there is such an improvement, and to be honest, there are some signs, including Soviet leader Gorbachev's own words, that it is not impossible. And to be honest, then if it would be possible and creditable to consider the adoption of new proposals, assuming we see some progress, some performance. Indeed, that was the critical issue that confronted the Bern Human Contacts Conference in late spring, as to whether or not the words that the Soviets were prepared to sign on to were matched by effective deeds. It will be crucial that there be balance between whatever new measures are considered. For example, we will be particularly alert that the military security side of CSCE, which the Soviets favor, as Ambassador Zimmerman has pointed out so well, was in fact the raison d'etre for the Soviets moving forward. We do not want that interest, shared in many parts by the Europeans, to overshadow the continuing critical focus that the United States places on the human rights components of the Helsinki process. The possibility of an agreement in CSCE's Stockholm meeting, the CDE, on military competence and security building measures, contrasted with the absence of progress at the recent human rights and family reunification meetings of Helsinki signatory states, highlights the dangers in this area. Thirdly, as I mentioned before, I believe it is essential that the least we can do in Vienna is to lay out the record on human rights as it really is, giving credit where it is due, but holding human rights violators strictly and publicly accountable for their unacceptable actions. Thus, in summary, what the Helsinki Commission seeks out of the Vienna conference are three things: a significant degree of compliance in the human rights area by the Soviet Union and the states of Eastern Europe. Secondly, if such compliance is forthcoming, and only then the introduction of a reasonable balance among any new activities which the conference may wish to undertake. And lastly, and a straightforward, no-holds-barred review of the record of compliance with undertakings of the Helsinki Accords. The achievement of these three objectives would mark the Vienna Conference as a watershed, not only in the Helsinki process, but in the East-West relations as a whole. In conclusion, Frank, let me thank the Council for allowing us this opportunity to appear before you, and for Ambassador Zimmerman to appear here, indeed an expert on the process, historically and as it's presently being carried out. We on the Commission believe very strongly that it is critically important for informed individuals throughout the United States, and certainly this is as informed a group on foreign affairs as we have in the state of Maryland, to be knowledgeable about this process, to realize the importance of this process, as Ambassador Zimmerman has pointed out, the only forum, essentially, in which the East and the West meet in a multilateral fashion on a regular basis, under set kinds of procedures. We believe it is important that you know of that process, that you focus on that process, and that you join with us in calling the Soviets and the East to compliance with their Helsinki undertakings. We believe it is a process that, although slow, although incremental, is important in furthering the causes for which this nation has stood and which the Helsinki Final Act now stands. Thank you very much.
For your description and assessment of the Helsinki process, we certainly thank you, Ambassador Zimmerman, and for treating the prospects for the upcoming conference. Representative Hoyer, we thank you very much. We're fortunate now to have until 7:15 to ask questions. I'll recognize you, but Ambassador Zimmerman will repeat the questions. If they're on the Commission, Representative Hoyer will repeat the questions for the benefit of the audience and the cameras. Yes, sir.
I would like to thank Ambassador Zimmerman for his cogent remarks on the process and showing that it's a bully pulpit. As I understand it, the Helsinki Accords really have the force of law, and we're able to point out who the lawbreakers are. Since Madrid, we've had defiance by our administration of the World Court over some things that happened in Nicaragua. I wonder if you could assess what impact that defiance of the World Court might have on Vienna, and I wonder if Representative Hoyer might also.
Did everybody hear the question, or should I repeat it, Frank?
Repeat it, please.
Yeah, well, the question was whether the U.S. defiance of the World Court over Nicaragua would have some effect on Vienna. I think the answer is probably yes. We are going to be very candid with the Soviet Union. We expect them to respond with attacks on us. I expect they're going to have something to say about South Africa, they're going to have something to say about Nicaragua, and probably the World Court aspects of that as well. So we're essentially not afraid of a debate on issues that range beyond the territory of Europe. Indeed, that's exactly the kind of debate we've been trying to get the Soviets into for a long time, an open debate on the issues and on the merits. So I think those will come up, and I would welcome them if they do.
I want to make a comment. If you just comment, because I think it's important to understand that, in fact, the Helsinki Final Accords do not carry the weight of being legally enforceable. They are essentially political undertakings, representations made by 35 independent sovereign nations who did, and it is specifically outlined in the Helsinki Accords, that they are not subject to enforcement through international forums. I was pleased to hear the ambassador's response, because I agree. There is no little doubt that the failure of the United States, or the withdrawal of the United States from the World Court process, will be used by the Soviets as an indication that the United States does not pursue its claim of abiding by international law. There will not, however, be an absolute analog there, because of the fact that there is not now an enforceable document or undertaking in the Helsinki Final Act, in the World Court, or any other form.
Yes, sir, in the center.
I wonder what can we expect from the Russian compliance with the civil rights, when in the last issue of New York Times it was an article reviewing the effect of Chernobyl, and they present a number of paragraphs saying that thousands of Estonians have been forcefully moved from Estonia to Chernobyl to do the cleaning for the Russian government.
Well, the question was, what can we expect of the Soviets in the human rights area when they have been forcing Estonian workers to clean up the radiation-affected areas in Chernobyl. Well, Soviet compliance in general, and the case you cite is a very good example of it, has been very poor. And I don't think anybody can deny that fact. And we are going to make a great deal of that fact. We may even cite the case you mentioned, if we can substantiate it. Sorry?
In the New York Times, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, I thought the Baltimore Sun was the only authoritative paper around. But we will be very open about that. What can we expect of the Soviets? We are doing the best we can to construct a system of incentives and penalties that would be hopefully designed to cause the Soviets to do better on compliance than they have in the past.
Yes, sir.
Ambassador, when we follow the work in Vienna, for all of us to mentally visualize what's going on, how large a staff are you and the Commission dealing with, and how many Americans are we talking about working with you and the other ambassadors at Vienna?
Okay. Question was, how large a staff will we have? What will it be like? We will have, I would guess, and these are rough figures, we will have 6 or 7 officers from the State Department. We'll have about an equal number from the Commission. We will have representation in smaller numbers from other agencies of government, primarily the Defense Department, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, possibly the Commerce Department. And we will have, as Congressman Hoyer noted, 12 public members who will be drawn from the public sectors, many of them representing constituencies, ethnic constituencies, religious constituencies, which have an interest in human rights and in the Helsinki process in general. They won't be there for the full time, but we expect them to be there for the period between the beginning of the meeting and Christmas. So we're talking about a staff, if you leave the public members in a separate category, of something like 20 people. It's not large if you compare it to the 100 people we had in my last job as an arms controller in the nuclear and space talks. But it's a staff that I feel very proud of. It's one that brings a great deal of expertise and imagination to its work.
Aren't civil rights and freedom, civil rights the basis for freedom?
Yes, indeed they are. The question was, aren't civil rights the basis for freedom? Yes, I certainly would agree with that.
Yes, sir.
One of the principal victims and one of the major focuses in previous conferences on the Helsinki process have been the Jews of the Soviet Union. There are, as we know, 14,000 Jewish families that are now refusing and there are 400,000 that are actually being held hostage. It was interesting to me that when Dr. Byrd mentioned terrorism in the Middle East, which is going to be one of the subjects of the September 19th, I think, conference, that terrorism is practiced every day by the Soviet government. And I was interested in hearing, I think this from Representative Hoyer, that there will be actual victims will be presenting their cases, and I wondered if that will be part of the agenda, to hear from some of the victims like Sharansky and others, and Orlov, his family, whether others will be able to be, or Sakharov, whether they will be heard at the Vienna conference.
Yeah, the question was whether Jews who have been persecuted by the Soviet Union will be able to state their case at Vienna. We have made a very big point of encouraging relatives of people who are oppressed in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, as well as those who have a commitment to human rights in general. We've been encouraging them to come to Vienna. Now, they will not be able to speak from the rostrum, because this is a conference of government officials. But we have worked very hard to ensure that they will be given access to the delegates at the conference, that they will be admitted to the conference halls. They can go to the public sessions, and they can come to, and there will be areas of the conference hall that they can come to. Many of these groups have already said they're coming. We've said to them we would welcome them all. I personally invited Anatoly Sharansky to come when I met him in Washington several months ago, and he said he would. And this is a part, I think, of the public dimension that Congressman Hoyer was talking about, because these witnesses to human rights abuses will be in Vienna, will be talking publicly to the press, and will be giving first-hand accounts of what is going on. And I can assure you that those of us on the U.S. delegation will welcome them and will give them as much access as we possibly can.
Well, let me make a comment. I'd like to comment on that question. Natan Sharansky appeared before the commission when he was in Washington, and he was asked the question by a number of members of the commission as it relates to the debate as to whether or not our continued participation in the Helsinki process is worthwhile, or does it in fact paper over what are egregious violations by the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc nations. Sharansky was immediate in his response and very strong in his response that the continuing participation in this forum is critical to the continuation of hope by refuseniks, prisoners of Zion, dissidents in the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc nations, knowing that there is a process where their views will be aired, and as Ambassador Zimmerman has said, where our representatives from this country, and I might say that our Canadian brethren are equally strong in their recitation of cases, individual cases. And Sharansky was very interesting in making the point that although there may not be a press release about that in the Soviet Union, even those who are in jail are transferred from one jail to another. And for instance, the way that almost everybody in the Soviet Union that was incarcerated got to know about Sharansky was from prisoners moving from a facility in which he was incarcerated to another facility as they moved them around, this internal communication. So the answer, I think, is that individual cases are very strongly considered. The Commission makes a litany of cases available to, and the State Department, of course, works on this as well, but together to make sure that Ambassador Zimmerman and our other representatives have specific, verified, compelling cases to bring before this international forum.
A lot of you still have questions, but we're going to have to limit ourselves to perhaps two, and there have been two hands up for a long time. Yours, sir, and I
apologize to everyone else. Yours, sir. First you.
Ambassador, would you explain why the United Nations would not be an appropriate deliberative body to expand the types of issues that are discussed in the Helsinki process?
The question is, why would the United Nations not be the appropriate body to discuss the kinds of issues that are being discussed in the Helsinki process? Well, of course, the United Nations has discussed a lot of these issues itself. It's a bigger forum, though. It is somewhat less concentrated. That can be an advantage and a disadvantage. What I think is unique about Helsinki, and to some degree its greatest advantage, is it is narrower and it is dealing essentially with European problems, European countries, plus the United States and Canada, who have a big stake in Europe, dealing with European problems in a European setting. But there is a fair degree of communication between the Helsinki process and the United Nations. A United Nations representative speaks at the beginning of each one of these follow-up meetings. The countries, of course, are all represented in the United Nations, with the exception of Switzerland, so that there's a good deal of interplay. But I think there's a uniqueness about the Europeanness of the Helsinki process, which is valuable.
How does the Soviet Union justify or rationalize its flagrant violations not only of an international agreement to which it itself was a signatory, but also its very own constitution?
How does the Soviet Union justify its violations of this international agreement as well as its own constitution? Well, of course it claims that there's no violation. And that puts you into a rather remarkable pretzel of contortion. When you can say with a straight face, for example, that every Jew who wants to leave the Soviet Union has already left, you know, that can only evoke a certain degree of derision. But in fact, that is indeed how the Soviet Union and Gorbachev himself have justified their failure to issue more than 100 exit visas per month to Soviet Jews who want to leave the country. You have to go back to 1984 and to Orwell to really understand it.
Gentlemen, on behalf of the Council, I express our deep appreciation for what is authoritative and interesting. We'll look forward to the Vienna meetings, I think, with deeper understanding and attention. Thank you very much.
Well done. Well done, Warren. Thank you, Frank. What a good audience. My God.
Thank you for taking note of
You're going to keep me awake tonight with your question. That's it's a very, very thoughtful question.